What you're seeing behind me is 8.4 kilowatts worth of solar that I installed myself. Everything from getting the plans to submitting the permits to racking these panels, putting the wiring into the inverters, getting the interconnect agreement with my utility. I had some help obviously with getting the panels up on the roof and racked, but all of the thought behind it, everything was finalized by me. And I don't say that to brag, I say that to say that somebody with no electrical knowledge, so to speak, I'm not an electrician, can do this themselves, and certainly here in Fort Worth, Texas, is allowed to do this themselves. So this is what I wanted to show you, and what we've got here is 400 watt Jinko solar panels. These are the 144 cell panels. So you can see that they're kind of split up into two. So they're the 72 cell size. They're about 79 inches tall and 39 inches wide. I was able to fit 21 of them here on this one face of my roof. And the first thing I did when I was like, okay, I want to put solar on my roof is, for me, it was find some of the pieces that I would be using. And I realize it's a little bit backwards, but when I look at something and I want to do it DIY, I want to find that surplus equipment or that inexpensive stuff that's not low quality, but is available. Because a lot of times that's what drives the cost of something, is what is available. And I was able to find these 400 watt Jinkos for very inexpensive. So these cost me like 125 bucks a piece is what I paid for them. And they were not takeoffs, but they were rejects from a larger solar install out in West Texas. And they had, maybe a wiring issue, like the wire was cut or a diode was bad, or there was some cosmetic damage to the frame, something like that, that caused them to reject them, throw them in a pile, and we were able to buy them off of that company, and I put some of them on my roof. So the first thing I did was determine that I was using these 72 cell size panels. So I came up here and measured the roof and find out what layout I can use that would best fit my panels. There was a site that I was able to use for doing the solar plans, because once I kind of had an idea of what I wanted to do, then I needed someone to actually write up the plans and determine the ampacity of the cables and what type of wiring to use and the conduit fill and all this jazz, which I'm not an electrician and I can't do. Or at least I didn't know how to do, and I just felt lost, right? So I paid about 500 bucks to have somebody go through and design my system. I told them that I was using 21 panels up on my roof, and I told them that what inverters I was using, because I had found some surplus 6 kilowatt Solar City inverters for 600 bucks a piece. And I was like, I can do that. So I'd have to run 2 inverters. I could have done 1 inverter for 8.4 kilowatts. It would have been a little more over paneled than I would like, but I'm gonna add some more solar later. So I figured I'd just go ahead and add 2 inverters now. So I got 12 kilowatts worth of inverter, 8.4 worth of solar. And I figure in the future, I'll go up to about 14 kilowatts worth of panels on that 6 kilowatts or 12 kilowatts worth of inverters, and it'll be sized about right. I'll also have some south facing, some west facing, so I can grab some of that evening sun, but that's a conversation for here in a minute. So I got the plans back from them. I also got the engineer's stamp from them. So they had to ask me about some of the way that my attic was structured and whether it had certain support beams or whatnot. I sent them some pictures and they said, oh, yep, you're good to go. So I had the pieces that I need to then submit my permit to Fort Worth. Thankfully, I realized COVID is a horrible thing and a lot of stuff got shut down, but there was also some advantages. And in this case, the city of Fort Worth decided that they really should, make everything online for permits. So as a homeowner, previously I would have had to go down to the courthouse in order to submit my permit. In this case, I was able to do it online. So I did have to try and call them and wait on hold and get some advice on how to do it and how to submit it as a homeowner. But I managed to get through all of those pieces and get my stuff submitted. And once I figured out that I had to have the 2 different permits, one for electrical, one for structural, got everything submitted. I think it took them about a month overall to get everything finally approved, which was longer than I'd like, because I had some time in December where I would have been able to install it. Instead, they got me approved near the end of December or January, and I was able to start throwing stuff up on the roof. And of course, I wasn't sure if the way that I had planned it, Fort Worth was going to approve. So there was a lot of pieces that I hadn't bought. I had the panels sitting in the garage on a pallet, and I had 1 inverter, but I wasn't, terribly confident that they were going to approve the inverter. But then once they approved, I went and bought the other inverter, and I started looking at conduit. And I wanted to do everything in my attic. I didn't want conduit running across my roof where I could see it. I wanted a much cleaner install. So under one of these panels over here, I've got what they call a solid deck. And it slips up under, it's got the flashing to slip up under the shingles. And I was able to drill holes there into my attic up here. And then from there, I was able to work my way over to my utility room. And that was the other thing that I didn't want to do, is put the inverters outside. And that was mainly because my panel was on the other side of the house from my meter. So if I put the inverters out by my meter, then I would have to run my AC wires, my thick 8 gauge AC wires, which they would probably be heavier gauge if I had to run that far, from the inverter all the way over to my breaker panel. And I didn't want to have to do that. I wanted my inverters next to my breaker panel if possible. And for me, this was part of the confusing part with me. I actually had 2 breaker panels in my house. Let's go downstairs real quick, because this was everything to show upstairs, which was the panels. And really you can't see anything beyond what's already installed here. And it's iron ridge racking underneath. It was pretty easy to install. Finding the rafters actually wasn't that bad. Using a rubber mallet, just kind of banging around, you can go, oh yeah, that sounds a little bit different, and then drill a hole or two. And it wasn't too bad to end up drilling a hole where you weren't supposed to, because you can fill it with caulk, sticks and flat. I'm here what's affectionately called the mending room in our house, where you can see some of the alarm stuff was in here, and we have the main breaker panel. So this is our 200 amp panel that runs most of the house. So this set of wires runs back to the meter, which is actually on the opposite end of the house. I say opposite end, it's opposite side. So it's about 40 feet away from here. And then we come into one of my utility rooms. And as you can see, this is where my photovoltaic stuff comes in, because you can see all the warning labels everywhere. So this is a breaker panel here. Now, this utility room became available because it used to have my air conditioner in it. So this was the 5-ton air conditioner furnace that was downstairs, and that took up all this space back here in the corner. And then they also had the water heater that was right here. So the only thing left in here was the water heater. Ironically, this breaker panel, which is a 125 amp breaker panel, and that runs back to the meter base. So the meter base has 2 sets of lines coming off of it, one for the 200 amp panel and one for this 125 amp panel. 2 separate services off of the meter. So it's not a sub panel. This is a second main panel. I don't know what that's technically called from electrician speak, but anyway. So this ran the furnace and the air conditioner that was in this room. Nothing else. It was just that. I mean, there's a little outlet here that it ran as well. But the water heater that's actually sitting right here is actually run off of the main 200 amp breaker panel that's in the other room. So what I was able to do here, this is the breaker for the air conditioner that's outside, which is no longer active. As you can see, it's off. So this here is the 2 35 amp breakers for my Solar City inverters coming into my breaker panel. And then behind me are my 2 inverters. So I'll show you the wiring here a little bit, and I'll show you all my setup, and I'll show you the way it could be a lot easier for you. So this line here is my PV wires. I actually have 4 sets of wires. So that's 8 10 gauge wires. In my case, they were stranded because that's what they had available, but I think it pulled a little bit easier, so I was fine with it. And those are coming down here into this box. Now, why are they coming into this box? That's my rapid shutdown. I've got another video on that. And if I didn't have a rapid shutdown, so like if I was not in the city or had a ground mount, I wouldn't necessarily need a rapid shutdown. I wouldn't necessarily have this box. I could just land them straight into the inverters. So if you've got the space available, just do a ground mount. You can run your wires straight into the inverters. These things can handle like 580 volts DC input. So typically you don't need to do any combining to get into the inverters. You would just run, 1 string of panels into the inverter. And these inverters have 2 inputs each. So, up to 4.5 kilowatts each, but of course 3 and 3 or 3.5 and 3.5, something like that. You can have them a little offset because you have like 4.5 on one and like 3 on another, or 2.5 on another, and get to your 6 kilowatts, just depending on your roof faces, because you typically want one roof face, one direction of panels on a certain input to be optimal. So that's my PV in. All that's coming through there is my 8 positive and negative wires for my DC coming off the panels, and then the 1 ground wire that runs up to the Iron Ridge racking system, which grounds the panels and the racking down into here, and then that's I ran that ground into one of the inverters, which is grounded then to the rest of the house. So from the inverters, then of course I've just got my 8 gauge wire, my AC wire, that's running over to the 35 amp breakers. The other thing that I've got is the power supply and stuff in here for the DC rapid shutdown, which I'll leave that to the other video. And then this other piece of conduit is for the switch for my DC rapid shutdown. And I'll go show you that real quick, because that will show you how you could do this a little bit easier. Hopefully, if you're doing this, your yes, I can talk. Your things are all closer together. My stuff is a little bit spread apart, and I kind of like the spacing of it, and it worked out for me, but it took a lot more thought to figure out how I should have everything connected together. A lot of people have their breaker panel and their meter right next to each other, which, if you're building a house, makes sense to have it all next to each other. So I'm going to show you here where my breaker panel is. So here on the side of a house, I've got my meter base, and then on the other side of the wall here inside the garage, I've got my 2 breakers, my 125 amp breaker and my 200 amp breaker. This is a 320 amp service. Then what I've got is this. This is my shutdown box. So as you can see here, it's got the label for rapid shutdown. This is not a high current device. If I can shut this down. As you can see, the wires inside of here, quite small. That's just a 12 gauge wire, because all it's doing is shutting off a little 12 volt power supply for the DC rapid shutdown. So this is something that worried me a little bit, because once I got everything connected, this is past the code stuff, right? And the inspector came and looked at it. He said it's great. There was no AC disconnect here by the meter. And my interconnect agreement specifically says it needs an AC disconnect at the meter for the utility. In my case, it's Oncor. I got a little bit scared, and I wrote up a whole diagram and showed them, this is a DC disconnect. I realize it's not AC, and you said AC. I didn't read your stuff until after the fact, so I'm kind of happy about it, but they're pretty good on communication. I could have asked them and said, is this okay too? Because DC disconnect is a little newer in it's newer. Usually you just have the AC disconnect, because usually right here what you would have is you have your solar coming off the roof, you got your inverter, and then from your inverter you go into either the meter base or into your breaker panel. A lot of times those are outside, so it would pop into your breaker panel. If you want to turn it off, you just flip the switch, the DC disconnect on the inverter, and you're good. And it's all right here. In my case, the inverter's not out here. What Oncor was saying is they wanted an AC disconnect between the inverter and the power of the house, and they wanted the AC disconnect out here by the meter. So I gave them a diagram and I said, this is a DC disconnect, this is how it operates, it does the same thing, DC instead of AC, and they approved it, so it was fine. So just wanted to point that out. That might not be the case for all utilities. If I find that if you explain things clearly the first time with diagrams so people can see what it is, a lot of times they're like, okay, that's fine. If you just go to them and say, hey, it's a DC instead of an AC, they might be like, no, no, I said AC. So take the time, explain it, draw something out. I feel like that really helps a lot, is drawing something out to show them this is what I want to do. Is this okay? Because I think it meets the spirit of the law requirement, whatever. So that's what I've got out here, is really just this one box, which is my DC disconnect. So all in all, I probably spent about $10,000 getting this 8.4 kilowatt system in, taking into account that I ran more wires than I needed to, and I have an extra inverter so that later on I can add more. I think for very little I could add another 4 to 5 kilowatts on a west-facing roof. And that's the next thing that I wanted to get to, was when you're planning this out, you want to know everything start to finish. And that's really hard. It was really hard for me. I'm really bad about planning things start to finish. And the thing that I didn't look at until after I had everything installed and almost all approved was my not my interconnect agreement, but my retail provider. With Oncor, you've got a lot of options for retail providers, and so I just kind of figured that it would be okay. And there's about 4 of them that will do net metering. And that's where, of course, your solar is bought back from you during the day while you're overproducing. Because even in my house, where I have my solar sized to about 1/3 of my power usage, maybe a half, I don't use all of that during the day. There's actually a lot that still goes back to the utility, even with me only having 1/3. So if I had a full amount of panels to cover the whole house in one day, I'd be pushing a lot back onto the grid so that I could pull it off later in the evening. Because with the way that heat works here in Texas is your ACs are running a lot after 7 o'clock, after 6 o'clock, to try and keep everything cool after the whole house has been heated up from the sun all day long. And my net metering agreements are pretty sad. Recently, over the past 5 years or so, I can usually pay about 8 cents a kilowatt hour all in. That's transmission fees as well as taxes and energy fees and everything, right? All in 8 cents a kilowatt hour. With the net metering stuff, they wanted to charge me 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and then they would credit me for anything that I overproduced. The problem is, if I only made enough for half of my utilization that day, then I'm paying 15 cents a kilowatt hour for half my power, which totally negates having solar on my roof. Because if I only generate half and then I pay 15 cents for the other half, then I may as well have just not had solar on my roof. The solution that I came up with, and we'll see how well it works long term, because one would be to just put more panels on, and that would be fine. I wanted to do a small enough array that it was small enough for me to bite off and chew and swallow, which I did. I did it. It's done. But it took me 6 months because that's the way my projects run. What I did is I went ahead and signed up for a free nights plan with TXU. And what this allows me to do is throw some smart switches on some of my stuff, like my electric water heaters, and control my upstairs air conditioner pretty closely so it's just on during the nights and when my kids are up there napping. Keep the downstairs on all day long. And what this allows me to do is most of the power that I'm using during the day is coming from solar. Right now we are just starting summer and it's working out pretty well. When the sun's shining, there's no clouds, I'm getting about 7.2, 7.4 kilowatts. And that's plenty to run the downstairs air conditioner, to run the upstairs air conditioner, to run other random appliances, my base loads, which are usually about 500 or 600 watts. That's all fine, because I've got a 3-ton upstairs, 3-ton downstairs, which run at about 2,500 watts a piece. So that all works fine. You flip on the oven, you flip on a stovetop. We're all electric. We don't have any gas in the house. Then you go above. And so we pay a little more. Over the past couple weeks, our bill per day has been $2 to $4. And we typically stay under $200 in the hottest months of the summer, and we hit probably $250 in the winter months running our heat pumps and our heat strips when it gets super cold, like in February. I think we hit $300 in February when we had the ice storm here in Texas. So that'll be hard, is really the winter. I think the summer we're gonna be good. We'll be able to adjust some more loads until after 8 p.m. when the energy is free. And we'll be okay, but I'm gonna get some more solar installed. If I get some more solar installed on the west facing roof, that would take care of our loads in the evening with the, still needing to run the AC, but the power is waning off. Right now, about 6 p.m., we kind of hit that threshold where the downstairs AC running, everything, the upstairs AC is not, but we're hitting about 2,000 watts continuous load, and that solar will drop down below 2,000 watts and we start paying for electricity. So if we get some west facing panels, we could probably get to that 8 o'clock time frame, or at least really close to it. And we also have the upstairs AC that kicks on at like 7:30 because the kids go to bed at 8 and I don't want them to have to go to bed in a super hot room. So just some of the things to think about. I know that there's a lot to think about, right? I want you to know that yes, it's possible to do a DIY grid install. I'm sure that I haven't covered absolutely everything in this one video, but I'm gonna get this uploaded. I plan on doing one that's more detailed and I map it out a lot more and show you some footage of what we did to install it and how it looks under the panels and whatnot. But feel free to hit me up with questions, but fill up this comment thread on this video. Let's get some discussion going on, what does your utility look like if you've tried to apply for this? Does your municipality allow DIY electrical work? Typically, if it's a homeowner doing it, then you can do it, but you still have to apply for a permit. And how hard is that to do? Fort Worth ended up not being too hard. The inspector was actually really cool. He was really skeptical at the beginning because I'm a homeowner. But in the end, we end up talking about how electricians don't know what they're doing, which I think was his way of complimenting me that I did a good job. So it really comes down to paying attention to what you're doing, learn from everyone that you can, ask questions, and just do an excellent job at it. And try to think through, what is the purpose of this? They want all of the wires to be clipped underneath the panel. Why is that? That's because if they're touching the asphalt roof and they get super hot and melt, it could cause a short, and at 600 volts DC, you're gonna cause a fire and burn your house down. Like that kind of stuff, right? I hate code compliance. I hate that someone's controlling what I'm doing. But when you're messing with something that is this dangerous, it is a little bit, it feels good that somebody's looking at it and going, okay, yes, that's a good plan. It forced me to go buy the $500 plans from a guy that says this is the size of wire you should use and the size of conduit you should use, and don't overfill by this, and these are the lengths to run. That level of safety. And then the additional that at least they have an inspector come out and make sure that it doesn't look shoddy. He didn't really look at the work all that closely. Certainly didn't go up on the roof or open up any panels or anything. But I think he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he looked at the work that he could see and saw that it was high quality, and was able to sign off on it. So that's my experience with doing a DIY grid tie install, 8.4 kilowatts for about 10 grand. Which I was getting a little bit depressed about because apparently Tesla was doing $1 a watt, but it sounds like their prices have gone up since the last few months. So maybe they just pushed some people out of the market and now they're charging more. Usually it's $2 to $3 a watt on the low end for a grid tie install. And you got to think too, when they do that, they're doing cookie cutter. They run conduit over across the roof. They're hiring cheap guys. You're going to end up with a lot of holes in your roof, which, to be fair, I put a lot of holes in my roof. And they're running conduit over the eaves, and I don't know, it's a little worrisome because if they do it super cheap, what are you getting for it? I do like that I did this myself, and now I can do it again because I could go submit another permit and do another few panels on the west facing roof and go through the whole process again, and I really don't think it would be that big of a deal. I think it would be a 3-week project on the weekends and I'd be done. So it gives me that confidence to do it, and as you can tell, it took 6 months to do this. It was hard, but it was possible.